Good evening and welcome. Tonight we have a compilation of some of the best scary stories from July, accompanied by soothing rain sounds, perfect for listening to as you fall asleep. And with that said, let's begin. When I was young, around 10, my dad lived in an old log cabin about 15 miles west of Sheridan, in the foothills of the Bighorn Mountains. Every summer when I was visiting, we would go up into the mountains backpacking and fishing for 2 days every weekend. We would park the truck, hike into a remote area fishing for trout along the way, and make camp wherever we ended up. We encountered a number of strange, creepy things and got into some scary situations with wildlife, but the one that sticks with me the most was an ancient abandoned camp we found. We were hiking down a very steep slope to get an area of a creek that had been dammed up by beavers, hoping to catch some big trout. I had climbed out onto a rock ledge and was looking for a way down when I saw the stock in action of an old rusty rifle sticking out of a tree, where the tree had grown around the barrel years before, about 10 inches above the ground. Dad and I climbed down to check it out, and we found a small cave at the base of the rock formation, only about 12 inches deep, which would make a nice natural shelter, but a really terrible place to set up a long-term camp. Inside we found a bunch of really old stuff, 3 heavy-gauge unopened cans of food, an old cast-iron pot that had holes rusted all the way through it, a crusty old saddle and a bridle set, and a very deteriorated heavy wool blanket rolled up and tied with a leather belt. When we unwrapped the blanket, we found several personal items, including a rusty old cap and ball black powder revolver, a leather satchel with lead pistol shot, a powder horn with no black powder in it, tarnished old cartridges, presumably for the rifle in the tree, a straight razor, and most unsettling was a shirt with holes in it and over half of it stained with dried blood. As we stood there thinking about what all this meant, it occurred to me how remote this place was even at that time. This was in July of 1985, and the fact that whoever owned that shirt had been very seriously injured. Stuck on a steep slope in the middle of absolutely nowhere, I got serious chills down my spine. The only thing that somewhat dated this fateful campsite was the pistol and the rifle, both of which were made sometime in the 1870s according to my father. There's no way to ever know what happened to the man who owned all this stuff, but the fact that he or someone he knew was obviously shot twice with either a gun or arrow and all his belongings were sitting right where he left them, possibly 100 years later, it was highly unlikely he left that area alive. Discovering what amounts to a 100-year-old crime scene in a very remote wilderness kinda gave me the creeps, but mostly it just made me sad to know how hopeless and alone this guy must have felt when he died. My normal shifts were during the day, 9 to 5 like most people, but on that day we were short-handed on the night shift staff because the last person who worked during those hours had just quit. We had lately had a whole lot of people quitting the night shift, so that meant I had to cover. Weirdly enough, I had never had to work the graveyard shift before then, and I was actually excited for it. I had brought some coffee and 5-hour energy with me because the hours ran 10 till 5. And there was no way I'd make it that far naturally. I got to my tower right before 10, when it was already pitch black, and the cold July night had fully set in. The tower was fairly tall, with several flights of stairs leading up to the top. The whole thing was mostly surrounded by thick forest, except for the trail I came from, and a murky pond that was just to the right of the one of the tower's legs. The pond itself was covered in those little frog pads and had algae floating around over the surface. It was actually quite big for a natural lagoon. I climbed up and all I could hear was a non-stop sound of crickets, frogs and an occasional owl. When I hit the top, I fumbled with my keys until I found the right one and walked right on in. The one room was small and square-shaped. 3 of the walls were mostly glass and the other one was opaque and had the door I just came in. The roof went up like a pyramid for a short length until it peaked, and it was all made of wood. To my left was a nicely made bed, and a nightstand with a lamp and flashlight on top, not like I'd be using the bed though. On the wall next to that was the CB radio and a communication stand, which every one of those towers had. Next to that sat my refrigerator and microwave, which was part of a small kitchen that extended to the other wall as well. Inside the kitchen on the right wall were several cabinets, some small ones that held snacks and some canned foods, and another set of giant cabinets that I couldn't open, which likely had vacuums and other cleaning supplies that were above my pay grade. Roomy. I went over to the communications stand and did my standard check to make sure everything was properly working. I called into the ranger station channel and said, "Well, Donnie, it looks like it's just you and me tonight." Donnie didn't say anything back, so I figured he was just taking a shit. I went and grabbed the flashlight on the stand and reached into one of its drawers, pulling out a set of binoculars from it. I went back out onto the balcony and checked to make sure no fire hazards or any other kind of dangerous things were over there. Once I checked that box off my to-do list, I headed back inside and pulled out the chair from the communications stand and put it by one of the glass walls and grabbed a granola bar from one of the kitchen cabinets to munch on. I put the binoculars up to my eyes and looked over the surrounding forest. It didn't seem like any animals were up and about, and no birds were in the sky either. I skimmed over a couple of clearings to make sure that no teenagers were off camping illegally. Then I went and peeked over at a far ridge where I saw a snowman standing alone in a gap of the trees. Hold the fuck up, it was July. I peeked again to see it wasn't a snowman, but some kid in a shitty ghost costume. It looked like the ones from Charlie Brown, with the big black holes for eyes that looked more like they were coloured black than actual holes. The kid was still and staring right into my direction, unmoving. I couldn't see the kid's parents anywhere, and by now it was rolling up on 11, so that meant something was up. I broke contact on the kid and walked to the radio, called into the station. "Donnie, you off the shitter yet?" "Barely made it out, but I'm here." I chuckled. Donnie was always good for a laugh. "There's some kid with a blanket walking around the southeast sector, and they look alone." "A blanket? The hell are you talking about?" "It's a ghost costume. It's got like black holes for eyes and stuff." "You mean like the Charlie Brown costume? Can you check it out?" "Yeah, I'll go and see what's up. I'll call in the walkie-talkie to tell you what I see." "Roger that." I turned off the radio and crossed over to the nightstand drawer to grab the walkie-talkie. Once I had it, I sat back down in the chair and put the binoculars to my eyes, zooming into where the kid was. The ridge was empty with no kid in sight, which I knew would make this 1,000 times harder. I pulled up the antenna on the walkie-talkie and dialed to the right channel. "Donnie, you hear me?" "Yep, loud and clear. I'm getting close to the sector. I'm heading up to the ridge for a vantage point." "Perfect, that's where I saw the kid, but they've moved on since then." "Well, I'll just check around to see if I can find anything." I watched as Donnie came over the ridge, waving his flashlight around in the dark until he looked towards the tower and shrugged. "Nothing over here." "Damn, hopefully he turns up again. Until then, I'll just notify the police and check with any missing reports." "Alright, I'll go back to..." Donnie's voice cut out and I saw his flashlight turn off in the distance. The small lit up spot where he stood was swallowed in darkness. "Donnie? You there? Donnie?" I heard no response and I rushed outside the door and around the corner to where I saw him yelling his name, only to hear my voice echo into the woods, and that's when it hit me. There wasn't a single other sound in the entire forest. The crickets and the frogs had stopped chirping, the wind didn't rustle through the leaves. Everything was completely standstill. I could hear my heartbeat throbbing in my ears and nothing else. I moved my flashlight around the woods for some futile attempt to find him. I got into the state of mind where I got so scared my throat closed up, and if I moved I felt like something very bad was going to happen. I had to do something now. I turned around and as I did, I glanced at the stairs below me. At the bottom stood a skinny, horrifically angled woman. She was tall, dripping with water, with black hair and dark, murky blue skin that stretched across her bent and broken bones. Her grey dress was shredded, and her black shoes were muddy and wet, and her face, her eyes were milky white, and her mouth hung wide open like a snake. Like her jaw had been grossly broken, She let out a blood-curdling and ear-piercing scream of agony and began to shuffle up the stairs so fucking fast that I snapped out of my fear lock and I ran the fuck back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. There was no way she could run that fast, even if all her bones weren't broken into wrong directions. I ran back to the kitchen and grabbed the biggest knife I could find, and then I pulled out the walkie-talkie, screaming into it. "Is anyone there? Donnie, where the fuck are you? Someone answer me." Then I heard the creaking of a door. I slowly turned and I froze when I saw what was there. The door was still there, locked and shut, and had been completely undisturbed. What scared me was the once locked giant cabinet that now stood open, with a kid dressed like a Charlie Brown ghost standing just in front of it. I stood there, unmoving, until I heard the little shit giggle. I recognised that giggle. There's no fucking way. I pulled off the sheet to see one of Donnie's kids, Marvin, sporting a smirk and a walkie-talkie. "Dad? Joey, I got him." Pissed his pants just like I said he would, right? He and his other son laughed from the other end of the walkie. I was mad, but glad that I wasn't about to get murdered in a goddamn wooden tower. I grabbed his walkie and shot back. "Pissed me off is what you did, you fucking asshole. I hope you're happy." Hearing you scream like a little girl sure did make me happy, alright. Yeah, screw you too. That wasn't even me. That was your stupid zombie chick. Who is that, your wife? My what? Does the ghost look like a zombie from that far away? You said yourself it looked like No, the ghost, dumbass. The woman on the stairs. She screamed and ran up them so that she could scare me into the tower. Hell, she must be like an Olympic runner. Did you get Usain Bolt? Dean, I didn't put no woman on the stairs. In 2016, my boyfriend, now my husband, and I went camping in eastern Pennsylvania. The place we decided to stop for the night was primitive. Camping was free, no cell service, and barely a road. We did encounter 2 other people. They might not factor into what happened later at all, but they were creepy, so I'll describe them. The first was a woman who had her truck off to the side of the road a little as we drove past. She had the hood open and seemed to be waiting for someone to stop and offer help. Usually my boyfriend would have no problem helping someone, but he said this time something about her put him off. She didn't really seem like she needed help, and usually people who need help look at you hopefully as you approach. She looked like she just expected we would stop. That's what my boyfriend said anyway. I hadn't really noticed anything that strange about her. The next person came when we had chosen a spot and were setting up a fire for hot dogs. I had noticed people drive by a few times, but my boyfriend pointed out each time was the same car, and the man in the car watched us each time he passed. My boyfriend was a little uneasy about this, but we had driven around for a while before finding a place we liked. It had been raining and everything was muddy, and we wanted the driest site possible. He could have been doing the same thing. We briefly thought about moving, but the road was too muddy. If he wanted to find us, all he had to do was follow the tracks. There were some other tracks, but not many. He'd only had to backtrack a little to locate us again. He didn't come by another time, so we stayed and spent the several remaining hours before dark goofing off. No one else drove by. Whether or not those 2 had anything else to do with their experience, the real fear came later. We had gone to sleep in our tent, and sometime around 3 AM we were woken by this very loud noise. I can't describe it very well or even remember exactly what it sounded like, but my boyfriend said it reminded him of a chain gun revving up. It was also similar to how it would sound if someone recorded a shovel being dragged over gravel and played it over a loudspeaker, is another way he described it. He jumped up and looked out the little window, but couldn't really see anything. The sound repeated itself another few times. I was too scared to speak, so my boyfriend whispered that it was probably miles off and I should go back to sleep. I didn't question this, as I figured loud sounds could be easily heard miles off. After we left, he told me it sounded like it had actually been coming from just down the road, but he didn't want to freak me out. Looking back, I probably should have wondered why he would bother to whisper if apparently the sound was far off. I was still terrified. Every little thing I heard outside sounded like someone was walking around the tent. We laid there for a while longer when finally my boyfriend told me to go get dressed because we were leaving. I got alarmed by this, and even more alarmed when he unwrapped the machete we had brought just for this trip and its plastic before opening the tent. We quickly packed up and loaded the car. I looked around for footprints that weren't our own, but despite the moon providing plenty of light, I couldn't really see. I did point out something my boyfriend hadn't noticed though before we got into the car. There was a beer can by our dead fire that hasn't been there before. We didn't even bring beer. While we were driving away, my boyfriend explained that he was nervous someone might have been trying to lure us out, so he didn't think it was a good idea to run from the tent right away. He also half expected to find our gas tank had been siphoned out, but that wouldn't have stopped us because we had a hybrid car. We joked that would make a funny hybrid commercial. Number of brutal murders avoided by driving a hybrid, 2. We only joked because we were about shitting ourselves from fear and adrenaline even then. The rest of our trip, we only stayed in well-populated campsites or got a hotel. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return from a camping trip. A co-worker and I headed out in a general direction the teens had set off in. We'd been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometres into the woods, and at this point we start noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a child stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go in that area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for these teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night, still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settled down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise hoping to cover more ground before it gets hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I notice a bit of shirt that caught in a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close to the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometres east of us, and they're calling everybody back. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top, and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school and had one co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book and I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon, and from the position I was in, I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I laid there, enjoying the scenery, and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveying our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there, staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. To this day, I have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed the rest of the trip down. A few years back, I rented an apartment from a friend of mine. He had recently bought it and had it completely renovated. He put it up for sale but couldn't find a buyer, so I offered to rent it in the meantime. After moving in, I realised there was something wrong with the lady next door. She was about 45 but looked much older. She would sit up all night listening to Christian radio shows and talking loudly to someone. It got to the point where I couldn't sleep, so I went over to her place and asked her to keep it down. She opened her door and I got a quick peek. Her walls all had crosses painted on them in different colours, and words like Jesus and angels scribbled everywhere. The windows were painted black, letting no light in at all. It was damp, yellow, stained 50-year-old carpets, dog shit and cockroaches everywhere. No dog though. I asked her to please keep it down. She looked at me and shut the door, then she turned up the radio even louder. The next night I had my girlfriend staying over. I wake up in the middle of the night and see a shadow of a person next to the bed looking at us sleeping. I think I'm hallucinating, as I usually do in the dark when I'm sleepy. But then the shadow starts talking. It's my neighbour, and she's holding something in her hand. She broke in during the night, and who knows how long she stood there. "You should lock your door at night," she says, and walks out. The next morning, I hear someone making strange noises below my bedroom window. It's my neighbour, talking to herself in tongue. She has a plastic bag in her hand with her rotting dead dog inside. It's hot as hell outside and I can smell death from the bag. At this point I'm scared shitless. She's obviously very mentally unwell. I go upstairs and knock on another person's door and ask what the hell is going on. The guy is as scared as me. Apparently she broke into his apartment one evening as well while he was watching TV with his kids. He got up from the couch to get a snack only to find her behind the couch, staring at him, holding a power drill. At this stage I'm basically shitting myself. I call the cops and they know all about her. Apparently she is a violent schizo and she hasn't taken her meds, but they can't force her or enter her apartment without her permission because she owns it. The only thing they can do is get her when she goes outside. I sit up for the next 2 days waiting for her to run out of cigarettes. When I hear her leave at 2 a.m. to go across the road to the 7-Eleven, I call the cops. They have 3 cars and a special van over in less than 2 minutes. They restrain her and throw her in the van and drive off to some institution, and in less than a minute, it's like she was never there. I've never seen her again, but I still have nightmares about her looking at me in my sleep. Up until I was about 8 or so, I lived in a really old house that, since the beginning of time, had been bounced around from relative to relative, until eventually my mother had been handed over the keys. It was basically a shit heap. 2 stories, a collapsed balcony on the 2nd level, mould and mildew all over most of the ceilings, 1 tiny bathroom and the toilet was outside, overrun with frogs and spiders and whatever other kind of hellspawn the Australian outback would throw at us. I was terrified as a child, scared of basically everything. I'm much better now and have much bigger balls than most of my friends, if I do say so myself. Nonetheless, I would probably have to put the blame on this old house of mine. I remembered as a child that I would always have the same dream. I'd start in the kitchen, no idea how I got there of course. It was during the day, probably late in the afternoon. Nobody was around, so naturally I'd go looking for my mother and father. I'd go to all the normal places. Mum wasn't in the laundry, shed or the lounge room. Dad wasn't on the patio outside or up the back at the chicken coop. And my sister wasn't around either. I was starting to get worried, thinking that everyone was gone and they'd left me alone. Until I heard a noise above me coming from the 2nd floor, where the bedrooms are. Relieved, I darted towards the stairs and jumped on the 1st step. Then I felt it. There was something in the back of my head, making me stop. Legs still raised up, I prepared to move on to the 2nd step. Something telling me that I shouldn't go up there. Of course this thought was running rampant in my mind. Don't go up there, don't go up there, stay down here, don't go up there, there's something up there. Finally my leg dropped before I could reconsider. I pushed myself up those stairs, and even though I didn't want to anymore, I couldn't stop myself, only slow down. Each step up was taken at agonisingly slow pace, and I wanted so bad just to go back downstairs and find someone, run to my grandparents' house and stay with them until my mum was home. But eventually, I rounded the corner, leaving only the last few steps leading up to the floor ahead of me. There was nothing there. I couldn't see anything in the stairwell. I started getting hopeful at this point. Maybe it's okay. Nobody's here. I was just imagining things and it's going to be fine. I'm still taking the slow steps up when it appears. Something's there. I can't actually remember what it was, and I never could after I woke up. But it was horrifying beyond belief, and I would always try to close my eyes because that was my thing as a child. If you can't see it, then it can't see you. But I could still see it. I couldn't blink, I couldn't shut my eyes. It was like my eyelids weren't working. I would even try holding my hands in front of my face, but still I couldn't block it out. I could see through my hands, and I couldn't do anything. I was frozen, unable to do anything except stare at this thing all but a metre away from me. Whatever I saw, whatever I did, for those 8 years I was in that house, I had to force myself up the stairs. Day or night, it was horrifying. My mother sighed and tried to reason with me. My father growled at me and called me a coward, and my sister just laughed and said I was retarded. But every time I had to go up those stairs, as soon as I hit the top stairwell, I had to stop and make sure that I could cover my eyes with my hands, or that I could shut my eyes. Of course it would terrify me most when I'd go to blink and wave my hand in front of my face, and it wouldn't work and I'd realise I was dreaming. New Year's Day, 1995. I was in the middle of third year of university, and a bunch of friends had come down to visit me and my roommate for the festivities. We were all pretty hungover from drinking the night before, and went out for our usual nice day out, a bit chilly, I don't feel so good post-greasy breakfast hungover stroll around the neighbourhood. 2 of these friends were twin brothers. One of them we hung out with all the time. The other we'd just met for the first time. He was pretty normal the night before, joining in the fun. But on this day, we were all hanging around a local basketball court shooting hoops with an old basketball we'd found in the grass. And this twin brother kept following me around all over the place with the creepiest grin I've ever seen in my life, staring right into the nether regions of my soul the whole time. I'd back away and join the group again, and he'd keep following me around. When we were walking back to the apartment, it was just me and him walking down the sidewalk behind the group, and he moved over in front of me, stared at me with his creepy look again, and fell down to his knees as if to worship me or something. I didn't know what to do. "Hey buddy, you alright? We're heading back now, right?" And so on, but he wouldn't say anything. He'd just be there on his knees, looking up at me with a clenched face and squinted eyes, as if he were looking directly into the sun. Later that day, my roomie said he was tripping balls, so I thought nothing of it and moved on with my life. A few weeks later, we got a phone call from the twin brother we usually hung out with, and it turned out that his other twin brother went over to his aunt's place with a knife and stabbed her 14 times. She didn't die, thankfully, but, still pretty bad. He had even called the police before going because he knew he was going to do it, but he couldn't stop himself from doing it. Because, the voices and so on. The ensuing court case was widely covered in the media, and this was a relatively small community where this sort of thing doesn't happen on a regular basis. I was reading one of the articles, and one of the testimonies was that the twin brother was severely schizophrenic and was hearing voices in his head. He believed to his very bones that his aunt was the devil, and that he had been commanded by God to go and kill her. So, who was this God that told him to go and kill her? Well, all the newspaper articles described it was a guy in a group he hung out with on New Year's Day. Didn't take me long to realise he was talking about me. This was 22 years ago, and I know for a fact it was mental illness, but just knowing that I had somehow commanded him to go and kill his aunt stays with me to this day. Growing up, I lived in the middle of the woods, no neighbours for about a mile on each side, and we owned 60 acres of forest. then a swamp after that. So basically, I lived in the middle of nowhere. One summer when I was about 14, I was out in the middle of the woods playing with my dog. I'm an only child and both my parents were out of town. When I kept feeling something hit my elbow. I'd go to throw Max's ball and the bump would make me throw it almost straight up. Assuming it was just me bumping it on trees or something, I ignored it. After the 4th or 5th time of it happening, I thought, well, this sucks, I'll just go home. Walking back, I felt uneasy, but I knew I was just freaking myself out because we were alone. About an hour later, Max and I are at home on the couch, and the garage door opens and he starts barking. I hop up to go let in my mum or dad, even though they were home really early. I peered through the peephole and saw the door was still shut and no one was in the garage. Quieting Max down, I opened the door slowly and called out for my dad. Nothing. No response at all, so I go out to check the door and it's still locked. Okay, sure. Weird, but oh well. Max heard it too, so at least I know I'm not crazy. About 20 minutes later, I hear the door open again, and this time Max starts growling like crazy. I quiet him down again and just assume it's the wind or something making noise, even though by this point, my heart is racing. I hear footsteps come up the stairs and think, oh geez, Dad really is home this time, and hop up and run to the door. It starts to jiggle, so I run faster to let him in. I peep through the hole, and even though my hand is loosely around the jiggling handle, there's no one else on the other side of the door. Terrified, I go hide on the couch with all the lights on. Max is still growling. About an hour after that, I start to feel a little better, even though I'm still terrified. Then I hear the door jangle again. This time, it was Max jiggling it. He needed to go outside, and the only way outside is through the garage. Fantastic. I literally sprint with him to the kennel, and as I'm standing in there, I decide to ask this thing questions to make myself feel better because I knew it wouldn't answer me. Thinking about what to ask it, my eyes are drawn to the huge heavy oak door in the kennel. It was always open because it was too heavy for me to move easily. I said, okay Ghost, if you're real, you'll shut this heavy door. Nothing. A minute goes by and still nothing. Max is still sniffing around. I turn around to yell at him to hurry up, and then from behind me I hear a click. I whipped around and saw the giant door had swung shut and latched. Okay, clearly it was just the wind. It wasn't really windy, but it was the wind for sure. Had to be. I proceed. Okay Ghost, that was the wind. If you're really real, you'll open the massive door back up. Nothing. I relax a bit and then squat down with my head in on my knees, reminiscing about how lame I just was, being scared when I hear a click-clack. The door was now wide open. Max was done, so we booked it back into the house, locking every door in the house. For the next 4 hours, I would hear the footsteps on the stairs and the door handle jiggling every few minutes, until finally around 11 PM, my dad walks in and yells at me for wasting electricity. I never told him or my mum about it until about 4 months later when my dad came in from hunting after dark. He looked shaken and asked him what was wrong. He said he aimed at 2 deer but missed both completely because it felt as if something was hitting his elbow and making him shoot way above the deer. That's when I told him everything. Our old house was on a corner, and in lieu of the backyard had a side yard, with a small deck that wrapped around the back. The dining room had a patio doors that led out to the back, and we would have barbecues and such back there. When I was about 14, we only had one desktop computer and one laptop for the family. My brother and I would fight over the desktop, that's where Diablo 2 was installed, so I would use the laptop to write music. On one particular night, my brother had a friend over and they were downstairs doing whatever, and I was in the dining room table on the laptop. As I was wrapped up in my writing, I didn't pay much attention to my surroundings. I heard a knock on the patio door which startled me. I looked up, expecting my brother or his friend. The basement had a door that led to the back deck as well. Standing at the door and waving was a person, wearing a Halloween pig mask. Thinking it was my brother or his friend, I mouthed, good one, and gave the person the finger and they walked away. As soon as they left, I went downstairs to give them shit, and to my surprise and dismay, they were both sitting on the couch playing PlayStation. They swore up and down it wasn't either of them, and there was no way one of them would have time to go downstairs and unmask before going back on the couch. To this day, I have no idea who it was that knocked and waved. We were living with my brother-in-law and his 2 teens when I was pregnant. He had an elevated house and quite a bit of farmer hunting land several miles down a country road. My husband works 7 till 6 and brother-in-law works offshore for 14 days. While he was at work, his kids stayed with their grandmother. Nice house, but it had a weird vibe. I chalked it up to pregnancy hormones. One day, home alone, I was taking a shower and felt someone staring at me. I stuck my head out and listened. Couldn't hear anyone in the house, so I resumed my shower. A while later, I heard the back door shut. I was standing in the kitchen and could see the door, which had no steps and was 6 foot from the ground. The door was still locked. I told my husband about it that night, and he shrugged it off. We locked down and went to bed. I don't know how long I'd been asleep, but I woke up to the blankets being yanked off the bed and my husband flipping on every light in the house. He threw open every door, every cabinet, looked in every pantry or closet while holding his handgun. I asked what was going on and he swore he heard boots thumping through the house and someone talking. Everything was still locked and it's not a big house. Nobody was there except us. One night, a while later, my niece came into her room. Her dad worked over and we had them for a few days, and asked to sleep in the bed with us. Now, the girl isn't scared of anything and she's 14 at the time. I sat up, told my husband to scoot over, and patted my pillow. That's when I noticed her 16-year-old brother curled up under a blanket on the floor beside me. Why are you both in a room at 2 in the morning? They didn't want to answer at first, but explained something in my niece's room laughs at night. I hated that room when we moved in and put up any laundry I did quickly in there. I asked my nephew why he was on the floor and he said, "She came into my room on the cot to sleep, but something started knocking on the door. We came down here as soon as it stopped." Again my husband flipped on every light, looked in every nook and every cranny. Nothing. Eventually we moved out and the kids decided to live full time with Grandma. My husband said he heard a man laughing in my niece's room, but there was nobody there when he turned the lights on. Scared the shit out of him. We had quite a large house, shaped like an L, but the L was cut into the hill, so the L had a downstairs, which was almost underground. It had windows facing out, but a lot was either in the hill or under another floor. I had the room on the bottom part of the L from 13 onwards. My room had 2 doors, one that opened out to a kind of rumpus room, and one to an ensuite. It was always creepy as fuck, but being a skeptic, I dared anything there to do something to me. Grew up fine, but I could never sleep unless both doors were shut. When my parents went away, I'd break the rules and bring my dog in to sleep in the bed. I woke a few times lately to see her alert and staring at the door of the rumpus room. Occasionally, I could hear her clawing at the screen of the window, but we had dogs, cats, horses, and the local bush turkeys, foxes, and so on. I figured if something was there that shouldn't have been, my dogs would have gone ballistic. Fast forward 5 years, bring a new girlfriend to my house to meet my parents, slept in my old room. She woke up screaming between 12 and 3 AM twice out of the 3 nights we stayed there. I've been with her for 5 years since, and it's only happened in that room. She won't sleep in the house anymore. My parents let my younger sister move into that room about 4 years ago. She asked me recently if I had ever heard scratching on the window late at night. Both of the dogs we had, plus the cat and the horses, are all dead. It's been roughly 10 years. So the scratching is unlikely to be any pets, unless the local animals are fucking with us. She also said she can't sleep unless both doors are shut, and she'll often put door stops under both doors so she can hear if either of them open. She googled some stuff and decided to sage the room, and said she's had hectic nightmares since and woke up screaming late at night a few times. For reference, she was 14 when the night terrors happened with my girlfriend, so we never told her. As I said, I am a skeptic, but it's still pretty creepy. This summer, after I graduated from high school, I left work early and went up to my parents' cabin in North Michigan. Spent that night at the beach watching the sunset. Once the sun went down and it became nearly pitch black, I got to my car and started driving down the highway. After about 10 seconds of being at speed, there was an older car that started riding my ass and flashing its high beams, so I got up to about 60 in a 45. They were still on my ass. I pulled off to the side road that my parents' cabin is off of, and they took the same turn. I thought this seemed weird because there's only about 30-40 houses on the road. So I went all the way to the end, which is usually a dead end but leads to a maintenance area for the golf course nearby. The truck was still following me. At this point I was freaking out because if I had pulled into the house they'd know where we lived, and they were still followed close by. I took a ton of random turns and the truck kept following every single turn for about 15 minutes. I finally had a chance to make a turn with traffic going through the intersection. That gave me a few seconds of a head start. Pulled down a side street, went up 100 yards, turned off all my lights and waited. Truck slowly drove by a perpendicular street and kept going. I booked at home, pulled my car around side away from the main road and pulled every curtain in the house. For an 18-year-old, I was scared as shit that night. I once worked as a live-in staff member in a college dormitory. During the summer, we housed a few summer school students who remained on campus. It may be significant to point out these students tended towards the highly academic, motivated, oftentimes high-stress students, if quiet. One warm day in late June, my office received a call from a concerned sibling that she and her family were unable to reach her brother who lived by himself in a room on the summer school floor. This wasn't unusual, as our office frequently dealt with students avoiding their parents due to frayed nerves or general social awkwardness. Our normal protocol to check in on a student is to try reach them by our emergency contact information. Failing that, we go check their room to verify they're living in the building and perhaps available then and there, then have them call their family to verify we followed up on the original request. Also, we are to only enter a room with another staff member present to ensure personal safety of staff and students. I failed to reach the student on his room and mobile phone, and was working short-staffed, so since I was on my own, I decided to pop up to his room and check on him. I arrived in his floor around 2 in the afternoon, and the floor seemed deserted as I had expected. I found his room number and immediately noticed the sound of a movie playing on a TV or computer from behind the door. I knocked 3 times and announced that I was staff member, checking on his health and safety. There was no answer. I didn't think that this was that remarkable. College students are notorious for leaving electronics running while not in the room. I checked the floor showers and bathrooms and I found them deserted. I returned to his door and knocked 3 more times, waited about 20 seconds between each knock. Still no answer. This is when my instincts started to buzz. I worked in a residence halls a number of years as a professional, and something about all these pieces of this puzzle weren't adding up. Family concerned about his health and safety, electronics running, someone must have started them recently within the time frame of a movie runtime. Summer school students and their idiosyncratic behaviour. Something wasn't right. I was by myself, so I probably let myself get more worked up than if I was with someone else. A deserted dorm floor, even at 2 in the afternoon, oftentimes evokes Kubrick memories of the Overlook Hotel. I decided that for some sense of closure or sanity, I needed the immediate resolution of keying into the student's room, even though I was by myself and not technically supposed to do so. I knocked on the door one more time, for good measure. Again announced myself as the hall director. I keyed into the room and my spider sense went off even stronger. The room appeared relatively vacant. The student appeared to be living out of a suitcase, which is unusual for someone staying no less than 8 weeks for a summer school session. The bedding was tussled like someone had been sleeping in it, and all the lights in the room were on. And as I had suspected, there was an open laptop on a desk running on battery power playing The Matrix, but no student. I began to start rationalising to keep me from feeling unsettled. Surely this student and I had crossed paths on my way to his room. I'd never met him before, so I wouldn't recognise him otherwise. And perhaps he was just down in the lobby picking up delivery food for a late lunch. Sure, that's it. Then I turned to leave, planning on trying to reach the student later in the afternoon or that night. As I turned to leave, I noticed another odd piece of evidence. The accordion closet doors, which are removed in most rooms due to disuse, particularly single rooms like this, were still in this room, and they were closed. Odd. I couldn't remember the last time I actually saw someone use these cranky, dysfunctional doors. Then my intuition spiked higher than ever. Shit. I realised I was alone in a room with potentially suicidal student who may, in fact, have completed just that. And I am about to be that guy who discovers a body and has a shitstorm of paperwork and undesirable tasks, not the least of which would be calling the family back to break the news. I felt like I was talking to myself when my voice cracked as I spoke to the closet doors and announced my name and title, and that I would be opening the accordion doors in 3 seconds. I fumbled with the latch on the doors and finally managed to get them disengaged. And as I slid the doors apart, I was unprepared. I don't know what I was really expecting. A hanging, a gunshot wound. I'll tell you what I didn't expect. A 7-foot dark-skinned Indian man staring at me embarrassingly as though I had found his secret hangout. We stared at each other for a good 15 seconds without blinking, breathing or speaking. I finally realised what was going on, and my natural emotion was disbelief. All I could think to say was, are you hiding from me? He looked at me and said, yeah. My heart was still racing. I turned to leave, and before I shut the door, I turned back to him and said, call your sister, she's worried about you. And frankly, I am too. I am fairly small for a guy. I stand at around 5'5", and the most I've ever weighed was around 150 pounds. About 6 or 7 years ago, I didn't have my licence despite being far old enough to drive, but a good buddy of mine wanted to hang out. He too did not have a way of transport, so we decided to both walk towards one another and meet in the middle. We would both be walking about 5 miles. It was 3 AM on a cold winter night, and I was wearing a black jacket with my hood up. About 2 miles into my hike along the main road, a car pulled into the parking spot of a home I was passing, just a few feet behind me. He wasn't entirely into the driveway, almost halfway hanging out into the road. I half expected it was just a kind stranger wanting to give me a ride, but I wasn't about to take any rides from anybody. I kept pacing forward and ignored the car behind me, expecting them to roll down a window and shout at me. It didn't happen. The car just sat at the edge of the driveway, running but completely dark inside to the point that I could only barely make out the figure of a large man. I don't typically get frightened by much, but something in the air made me tense up and my heart kind of dropped to my stomach. I stopped and turned to look at the car. I had a feeling that the person driving was watching me intently. The figure in the car was definitely facing me. I could see the reflection from his dash bouncing off of his eyes. I stared back. I figured he was about to yell out at me, but he just sat quietly in a strangely menacing way that I've only ever seen scenes in movies play out. I kinda did a wave at the figure, letting him know I saw him, and waited for some type of communication in return. He didn't budge, just stared intently. I returned to pacing away, slightly brisker. After just a few moments, I could hear the car slowly roll in reverse, so I turned to face it, but it kept pacing backwards. The car kept creeping, slowly. I pulled down my hood and stood still again, waiting for him to pass me. But instead the man slowed to a stop behind me. The passenger side window rolled down, and the man and I met eyes. No words were exchanged at all. and before I could even let out a hello, the man grimaced and accelerated away at a decent pace, almost as if he was disappointed by what he had seen. It doesn't seem like much from how it reads, but I'll never forget how intense that interaction was for me. I've not felt anything like it since. When I was 10, something real weird happened to my family. We were all asleep, as usual, and I slept in the same room as my brother and my mum with my father and younger brother. In the middle of the night, the safe in my parents' room started going off, as if someone was playing with it. My parents didn't think much about it, went back to bed, and right as they did that, my brother's toys, the ones that had those children's songs, started playing music, without anyone touching it. They were a little freaked out, but it went away after a few minutes, so they went back to bed. However, in the morning, when my mum brought my brother to the shower, she saw a red handprint on his back that was too big to be hers, but too small to be my father's. I saw the handprint, and it looked as though someone had slapped my brother, but nobody did, and he slept quite well. My mum called her family and told my grandparents about it. After a few phone calls, we found out that my parental grandma died that night while we were asleep. So our family came up with the explanation that my grandma wanted to see my newborn brother, so she paid us a little visit. My family's a bit superstitious, apparently quite common for South Europeans. I still am unable to explain that, and it still is a little scary to think about to this day. When I was 14, my family and I fell on hard times. We got kicked out of our house and ended up in emergency housing. Basically, we went to a charity who found us a house that we were able to rent for $100 a month, but for only 3 months. That summer, my mum and stepdad separated temporarily, and my 3 younger siblings would go to my stepdad's for a week or so, then come back to my mum and me. This house was fucking creepy. It started off with just that feeling, like something isn't quite right, that you might not be the only person in the room. In the day, that's all it was, the feeling that something was up, your instincts pricking at you. I tried to ignore it, but as soon as dusk arrived, shit would start happening. More than once I could hear the static-filled music playing, but I couldn't find the source. It just filled the halls. I heard whispering and went to my 2 sisters' room. In the open closet, a pair of eyes looked at me and disappeared. My brother spent one night in the house and didn't come back. In my room, I could never win. On one wall, a mirror, when I flipped over to face the window, I watched tall shadow figures pace in front of it. In my mother's room, the same shadow figures paced in circles around her room. One night, she and I sat up for 2 hours in her bed watching these shadows. She was strongly religious and didn't know what to make of it. During the time we lived there was a lunar eclipse. I'd never seen one before and was very excited for it. When I went out to look every time, this terror took over me and I couldn't stay outside. I couldn't explain it. When the moon was fully cloaked, I went outside, looked up, but my head suddenly snapped down and to my left. I could see 3 tall shadows walking in between the tall pine trees in the yard. Panicked, I ran back inside and into my room, flinging myself under the covers with my eyes shut tightly, but listened to the pacing outside my bedroom window. 3 months of this, we moved out at the end of summer into a new house. My mum and stepdad got back together and I was with my younger siblings again. We all agreed the house on Acorn Street was fucked up, and still get chills when we drive by it, just to see. So I'm your average 21-year-old girl who in her spare time likes to go on dating apps. I found a knockoff dating app that's kinda like Tinder, but it's for guys that like curvy women. So off the bat I find a couple of nice guys to chat with, but the next day I get a message that changed everything. Usually my type is guys my age, but he was older, like in his 40s older. We weren't even 8 chat bubbles in until he said, "I can tell that you'd be a wonderful mother." I took it as a compliment at first, That wasn't the creepiest thing I've heard a guy say to me. Honestly, I should have stopped talking to him, but I was bored and the rest of my chats ghosted me, so I just stuck with the conversation. He told me how he lives in the next town over from my small town, so he was actually really close to me. He was a single dad, so that "you'll be a wonderful mother" compliment meant something different now, in a creepy way. He was a bartender at 2 bars, one in his town, and he worked at another bar in my town. At the bar in my town where he did weekend shifts, he was only 5 minutes away, which kinda unnerved me because I didn't want to see him in real life. A week later, he started getting really clingy, sending me good morning texts with 4 emojis following it. I didn't want to be mean, so I kept it short and simple and said hi back. Then he said, "Listen, I'm going to the beach this weekend in my Jeep. I'd love for you to come so I can make you happy for a day. Plus, I'd like to get a peek at that curvy body that you claim to have." I said I was busy with work stuff and that I couldn't go. He just dismissed it and said he'd miss me. I did feel like going to the beach though that day, so I went to a local spot that was past his town by a few miles. I was there for about an hour and I was tanning on my stomach, but then I heard someone walking up to me. Looking up, I saw a beefy looking guy who looked to be late 30s. He smiled at me in a weird way which freaked me out before I could ask what his deal was. He said, "So, this is work stuff." My heart stopped for a second. It couldn't be him. I never saw his face before, but who else would know what I said in my text messages? This was the beach I was going to. What a coincidence, huh? He smirked. I just nodded and started to gather my things. Yeah, really is a coincidence. When I stood up, he took a long stride forward so that he stood in front of me, leaving little space between us. "Hey, looks like you've changed to go swimming. Shall we go into the water?" He smirked again. I was getting really nervous. I said no and went to my car quickly and drove off. I saw him standing on the grass beside the road waving at me with a smile. What a fucking psycho. Another week passed and I kept my communications with him short, but during the week I had odd run-ins with him. First at Walmart. I could understand this because he lives in a house behind Walmart, but still it was weird. Then I went to a bar that was a couple of minutes from my house. I was with my friend and we took some pictures together and I put them on Instagram. 30 minutes later, he came in with his work attire on. He sat down next to me while my friend was on the other side. "Oh, you come here too?" I look at him oddly and say, "I come here every Friday with my friend. I've never seen you here before. Why are you here?" "Just passing by and saw your car and thought I'd say hi. Also, what are you drinking? I can buy you another." My friend grabs my knee and I know she's telling me to get the fuck out of here. I just say no thanks and quickly pay for my drinks. He got up too and followed us outside. "You can't drive, you've been drinking. Let me take you home. I can take care of you." I was scared. His tone of voice sounded so desperate. I said no and walked to my car and drove home, also making sure I wasn't being followed. The next day I got a text early in the morning from him. "Hey baby, I was so worried about you last night. I did some digging on my laptop and found your address. You need to be more careful with your privacy, sweetie." I called him on his bluff saying he didn't have my address. In the next few seconds, there it was. My full address and even more information like the names of my parents, my full name, all their birthdays. I was terrified. "I can come over and comfort you now. I want to show you how much I love you and I'll make you fall for me too." I didn't know what to do. At the moment I was alone and I had to think fast. The neighbour across the street from me was an ex-cop, so I quickly gathered my keys and phone and ran to his house praying he'd be home. I saw his truck in the driveway and I felt so relieved. I saw him in the garage. I ran over telling him I needed help. He listened to my story, had a look of concern the whole time. He told me to come inside and look out the window for his Jeep to go down my driveway. If it was him and he turned into my driveway, my neighbour would call the police. It was about 20 minutes before I heard a loud noise coming down the road, and there he was in his Jeep. He turned right and slowed down, I guess to find the right house. He saw my address and quickly pulled in. My neighbour grabbed the phone and started talking to the police directly instead of the operator. I got a text on my phone from him saying, "I'm at your door, so this is where you hide." I feel sick. I'm just waiting for the police to come barreling down my road to get him. I think he realised I'm not answering the door, so he got back into his jeep to leave. But the timing couldn't be more perfect, because 2 police cars came around the corner and blocked off my driveway so he couldn't go anywhere. I went outside and I saw him in handcuffs. He saw me too, and he honestly looked heartbroken. I didn't feel bad though. What he did was crazy. There wasn't enough evidence to put him in jail for too long, but I did get a restraining order, which is working well so far. One night, unable to sleep, I mindlessly scrolled through TikTok, hoping to find something that would distract me from my restlessness. Among the countless TikTok live streams, one particular stream caught my attention. The title simply read, "A Midnight Stroll." Intrigued, I tapped on it, unknowingly opening the door to a world of horror. The stream depicted a man silently traversing through a desolate forest. The eerie atmosphere was suffocating, with darkness seemingly swallowing the lone figure. To my utter shock, as the livestream continued, the man's path led him to a familiar place, my backyard. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was my house. How could this be possible? Fear gripped my heart and I immediately dialed the emergency services, desperately hoping they could provide some answers. The police arrived swiftly, but to my dismay they found nothing out of the ordinary in the woods. Without any concrete evidence or immediate danger, they dismissed my claims. I figured that this account would probably go live again, and when it does, I'll screen record and get some proof. It took some time, but eventually the live stream resumed. Unfortunately for me this time, however, it did not reveal my house. Just hours of this man walking through the woods at night. Why are people even watching this, I thought to myself. The live stream that night was a bust. The man didn't do anything out of the ordinary besides, being a weirdo walking through the woods at night. I anxiously waited for the live stream to return. After 2 days, the account finally went live again, and this time I was prepared. I started to screen record, determined to capture the proof I so desperately needed. The stream unfolded just as before. The mysterious man paced through the dark woods, his footsteps crunching unsuspecting leaves. The sound of crickets could be distinctively heard. The man emerged from the depths of the forest, his gaze fixed on my house. But this time something was different. He started moving towards my house, step by step, drawing closer to me. The fear that had gripped me earlier escalated to sheer terror. I knew I had to take action. My fight or flight response activated and I descended the stairs from my room, making my way to the kitchen window, never taking my eyes off the live stream. I peered into the darkness, searching for any signs of the man approaching my house, but to my horror I saw nothing. I looked back down at my phone and then back up to the window, and back down at my phone again. The man was continuing to walk towards my house in the live stream, but I didn't see him in real time. The realisation struck me like a lightning bolt. The live stream had a delay. It had to have a stream delay. I watched him approach my back door on my phone. My mind raced as I frantically looked to the left and noticed my back door was ever so slightly cracked open. As a small business owner, Christmas is our busiest season. I own a souvenir shop and haven't had a day off since December the 1st. It was Christmas Eve and I sent all my employees home early. I was single and didn't have much family, so I didn't mind staying late and taking care of all the admin work. It was around 11:45 at night. I was in the back finishing some calculations when I heard a knock at the front door. I looked at my watch. It was almost midnight and we had been closed for almost 4 hours now. What would they want? Plus, it was snowing hard outside. I got up from the back and went to the front door. Standing there knocking was a man dressed as Santa. I politely went to the door and told him sorry that we're closed. The man shook his head and said he forgot his wallet and needed to come in and get it. I thought this was strange. I didn't find any wallet while doing my cleanup, and no one reported one missing either.
And if I'm being completely honest, this man dressed as Santa didn't look familiar. He definitely didn't shop here today. I politely told him that we didn't receive or find any wallet, but if we did, we'd be sure to send it to his address. The man shook his head again, pulling the door handle. He said he needs his wallet tonight and to let him in immediately. I told him I'd double check the back, and I went in the back, checked out our lost and found and saw nothing. I went back to the front door and told him we didn't have it, but if I find it I'll be sure to call and let him know. The man's face was boiling with rage at this point. He yanked hard on the door, rattling the glass. He demanded I let him in the store right now. My jolly spirit was slowly dying, and I told the man if he doesn't stop that I would call the police. He continued to yank on the door. He even said if I don't open up, he'll kill me. That was it. I told him I'm calling the police, and I went to the front desk phone and picked up the receiver. When I looked up, Santa was gone. I was a little shaken, but relieved the wacko was gone. I didn't call the police and went back into my office to finish up my work. It was almost 1 in the morning when I finished up. I was packing my things up and made my way to the front. I looked outside. My car was the only one in the parking lot. I didn't see the crazy man anywhere. I stepped out into the falling snow and hiked over to my car. About halfway there, I froze. I noticed fresh footprints heading towards my car and stopping there. And that's when I saw the top of a Santa hat in the back seat of my car. My jaw dropped. I saw someone peek their head up and the Santa man and I locked eyes. I booked it back to my shop. I could hear my car door close and heavy footsteps right behind me. I unlocked my shop door, threw myself in, and then quickly relocked it. I was just in time as the Santa man was already pulling on the door, trying to get in. He banged on the glass, screaming he was going to kill me and tear apart my intestines. I ran to the phone and called the cops. They actually got here quickly and arrested the man. As the cops pulled away with the Santa man in the back, I looked at my watch. It was 3 in the morning. Merry Christmas to me, I told myself. I've been an avid Tinder user. I work a lot and don't have a huge opportunity to meet new people, so I use Tinder. I used to set my preferences to much older men thinking they would be more mature. Boy, was I wrong. I have many scary stories from Tinder, but here's one from last summer. I matched with a guy, we will call him Rob. He was 54 and I was 24 at the time. He claimed he was a head chef at a local casino, so I thought he seems pretty put together. So I kind of have a system I use for Tinder. I chat with men I match with for several weeks, and if we both feel comfortable, we meet face to face. Most creeps don't wait that long, in my own experience. So the first night we chat, he starts getting too flirty. First saying how beautiful I am, then continuously complimenting my body. And as he continues, I get a little uncomfortable. Then he asks to meet. I say not yet, that I wanted to get to know him first. He understands and we talk for a few more days with the same kind of pattern. First it's normal to get to know you stuff. Then he would get too flirty and mention how he loves my curves. This then turns into what he would do to my curves and to me. I quickly but nicely try to jokingly tell him to stop and keep it clean as we don't know each other yet. He gets more and more brazen. He would message me dozens of times in a row a day and would get upset if I didn't answer right away. Like I said, I work a lot of my family's business. We're in the food industry as well, and I'm not able to text at work. I didn't tell him my last name or where I work, but I did say at my family's bakery and what town it was in. But there are at least 5 or 6 other bakeries that I know of in my town. The days go by and I start to respond less and less because his constant sexual texts will not relent. No matter how much I explain, it makes me uncomfortable, and I'm not looking for just a hookup. I wasn't set in a relationship, but if the chemistry is there, then we could explore it. But he would just get very angry with me the more I denied him. Finally, a week and a half later, I completely stopped talking to him and I blocked his number. Thought that was the last I'd hear of Rob, right? Wrong. I was at work, and it was the night shift on a Monday, so very slow and quiet, just me and another girl working. We get a phone call at work and my co-worker says it's for me. I am the manager, so I'm used to people asking for me, so I answer, saying my name and how I can help them. There's a pause, and what I hear next makes my heart stop beating. The man on the phone says, "Hi sweetheart, it's Rob." I'm frozen. I can't even find words to speak. I definitely didn't tell him where I work or have it posted on my social media, so how did he find me? I shakily ask how he found me. He says, "There are only so many bakeries in your town." This guy had called every bakery asking for a Kayla in my town. I'm freaking out at this point and don't know what to do. He tells me I have to come to his house tonight or else he will show up at my work. I don't know what else to do, so I agree just to get him off the phone. Then I hang up the phone and burst into tears. I very obviously did not go to his house, and I called out of work for the next couple of days. My sister who works at the bakery tells me the next day that a guy came in asking for me. I began receiving texts from random numbers, all from Rob saying that things he was going to do to me. I would leave work and there would be roses on my car. He would call my work every time I worked several times asking for me, and just breathing heavy on the line, or saying more things he wanted to do to me. Some days he would come into work and wait to get me and would just buy a Coca-Cola, then hang around for 45 minutes just watching me. It got so bad that I had to switch my schedule, but my car is pretty distinct, so it would be easy to tell if I was working. It got so bad I would be at school in a different town and he would leave more gifts on my car. I think I even caught him following me home once, but I can't be sure because he had several different vehicles. I started taking my mum's car to work and doing more of the baking so I wouldn't have to be out in the front with the customers, and I haven't heard from him in several months. Just the occasional text or odd phone call at my work. So, older guy from Tinder. Let's hope we never meet again. I was looking forward to my date tonight. I carefully put on my lipstick and slim-fitting dress, excited to meet this man I'd been talking to on Tinder for the last 3 weeks. I find it adorable that he has not yet met me and wishes to cook me dinner at his own place. A nice amount of effort made on his part. I get a taxi to his house and I'm greeted warmly with a smile and a hug. We sit down on the couch and he pours us both a glass of white wine, my favourite. As he got up to check on the dinner he was cooking in the kitchen, I noticed my glass of wine was fizzing, which is unusual as it's not a sparkling wine. I switched our glasses before he returned to the lounge so that he now had the fizzy drink, and I sat sipping the still wine. We spoke for around 20 minutes before he voiced that he was tired. I observed that he appeared sleepy, and before I knew it, he dropped his wine glass on the cream carpet and was passed out on the sofa exactly 30 minutes after he poured us the glasses of wine. He appeared dead to the world with noticeable splashes of saliva around his mouth, drooling in a deep sleep. I looked around me wondering if this was a coincidence, but then heard footsteps upstairs. Odd, he said he lived alone. I immediately felt my heart rate raise and my palms become sweaty as I heard footsteps come down the stairs. I heard a voice from behind the door saying, "Is she asleep yet?" I didn't respond. The footsteps started away from the door and made their way back up the stairs. I felt terrified, unable to control my breathing. I quietly started to gather my things when I heard a couple of male voices on the upstairs landing. I was unable to make out what they were saying, and a part of me didn't want to know what they were saying. Before I had time to think, I burst through the lounge door and into the hall and made a dash for the front door. Locked. My heart sank. I grabbed the keys from the side unit and lunged at the door in an attempt to open it, but I was shaking like a leaf. I heard a clatter upstairs and spun round to look behind me where I see 3 men start to walk down the stairs. I burst through the front door and into the garden. It was pitch black. As I was making my way for the garden front gate, I heard them shriek from the lounge, "You've given her the wrong glass," and the rest was a murmur as I ran for my life and did not stop running. My best friend's wife's friend had a crazy story. They caught the guy, so I can verify that this is true. She went on a Tinder date with some guy who invited her over to his apartment for dinner. For whatever reason, she decided that that would be acceptable and safe, given the guy was a total stranger. Guess he was hot, I don't know. So she goes to his place and he has it all done up romantic, like candles and everything. Made dinner and poured some wine. Halfway through the dinner, she starts to feel a bit ill. When she mentioned to him that her stomach was upset, she got fairly scared because the dude insisted she stayed longer and had more wine. After he persisted and kept trying to get her to eat and drink more, she felt uncomfortable and left. She said he was really upset, but not really angry, more disappointed than anything, and he allowed her to go reluctantly. She gets home and vomits a bunch. It's late, so she toughs it out, but she felt sick the next morning too, so she went to the doctor. They pumped her stomach and tell her they will run some tests. They figure it's probably just food poisoning, but tell her they will call her if there are any findings worth discussing. A few days later, the doctor calls her. She said he sounded concerned and told her she needs to come in immediately to discuss the test results. She arrived and the police were there, 3 cop cars and multiple officers and forensic trucks as well. Ends up, when they pumped her stomach, they found human meat. She had literally been eating people that this guy was feeding to her. Police asked for the address she met him at, and it ends up it was an Airbnb, and the name that was given was entirely false. The phone number she had called him on had also been disconnected and was no longer in use. Eventually they found a guy. I'm not sure what he was charged with or how much time he served. Just know he was eventually arrested a few months later. An abandoned hospital was not the ideal place for a first date, but I looked forward to meeting my date for the first time in real life. I find it both exhilarating and mysterious that he wishes to meet me at an ex-hospital which had been abandoned for 20 plus years to do some urban exploration. It was once a hospital for the management of airborne viruses and infectious diseases built in the early 1900s. I arrived at the abandoned hospital and my date walked towards me. He looked exactly like his pictures, tall, dark and handsome, and greeted me with a smile as well as a kiss on the cheek. We made our way to the main entrance and I was curious to know what was in his rucksack as I felt unprepared only bringing my phone. I asked what was in his backpack out of curiosity, as it looked heavy, to which he smiled and replied, "Camera, spare socks and a water bottle." How cute, I thought. As we made our way around the grand but dark and dingy building, we heard noises from afar. There was the occasional water droplet hitting the dirty ground which would make a loud echo noise, but the noises from afar were different, almost menacing. I started to feel my palms become sweaty and I felt uneasy. I asked him to stop messing with me, but he appeared nervous, strongly denying that the noises were coming from him. We made our way around the corridor after corridor, checking out each room as we went and decided to go to the morgue, something that I was not keen on doing. The closer we got to the morgue in the basement part of the building, the colder the atmosphere became, as well as the darkness becoming increasingly unnerving. The silence was so loud I felt uncomfortable, and I'm sure he did as well. Bang! We shrieked and both started running. "Don't leave me," I called after him, but he ran off, dropping his bag and did not look back. Leaving me and his bag behind him, my pulse was racing and I felt alone in complete darkness and silence, the light from the iPhone torch being the only company I had left. I glanced down towards his bag and felt thankful that he'd left it by accident, as it meant I could at least get a drink before trying to find my way back out of this hellhole. When I opened his bag, I moved a sharp knife, a piece of rope, a camcorder, cable ties and a large grey tape out of the way, but a bottle of water was nowhere to be found. Disappointing.
This happened to my brother and I in the summer of 1995. I was 24 and he was 22. We lived with our mum out in open desert at a place called Whispering Ranch, which was about 10 to 20 miles in any direction from the nearest town. The roads weren't paved and did not have electricity or running water. Because of that, we had to haul our water in from town. The only means of light we had were kerosene lanterns and flashlights. One day our mum asked us if we could walk down to our friend John's place and pick up some tools she needed for a project she was going to do the next day. We told her yeah, then headed out across the desert. It took less time because John lived about a mile away.
There would still be half a mile between us and the road to John's house. So anyway, we get to John's and sit under the shade to drink some water while he goes and gets the tools for our mum. He comes back and gives us the tools. We put them down and decided to stay and visit a little bit because it was scorching. After the sunset, we realised that it had gotten darker. The only means of light that we had was a flashlight. We told him we had to leave, so we grabbed the tools for our mum and said goodbye. We left and started to walk down the road. While walking home, we decided to cut across the desert to get home faster. We got halfway across the desert before it sounded like something was following us. At first, we didn't pay attention to it because out there, it wasn't uncommon to hear an animal at night. The further we walked, the sound of something breathing got closer and closer. My brother stopped and turned to see what was following us. That's when he saw it. 2 glowing red eyes staring at us. He tugged my arm, shushing me. He told me to move slowly, be quiet, and don't look back. I didn't listen to him. Turning around, I saw the eyes and screamed. We took off running towards our mums, and that's when it started chasing us. I ended up tripping, hitting my face on the ground. Between the night sky and our light, there was no telling where we were going. When I got up, I saw red eyes and I screamed for my brother. He came back and grabbed me, shoving the flashlight in my hand. He started running again, and so did the thing chasing us. By this time, we were scared. There was nothing to protect us from whatever was chasing us. Somehow, for a brief moment, my brother and I got separated. That's when I fell again, rolling over onto my back. I sat up, pointed the flashlight in the direction of the animal. That's when we saw what was chasing us. It was huge. I imagined if it stood, it would be about 8 feet tall. It had long, shiny black hair, a snout like a wolf, long, sharp claws, and it smelled like rotten flesh. It snarled at us, looking with its dead, cold eyes. We were scared, frozen in place at the sight in front of us. My brother snapped out of his trance, dragging me up to my feet. We wasted no time running as the creature screeched at us with a horrendous force. The creature pursued us quickly. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my legs. I thought it was going to get me at any second. Just then, the light of a bonfire came into view. We ran towards it, seeing my mum and family members. We collapsed in the front of them terrified, and for a few minutes couldn't even talk. They looked at us in confusion, wondering what we were worked up about. When we told them what happened, nobody believed us. They laughed and called us chickens because they thought there was nothing to be afraid of. The next morning, I woke up and went into the kitchen. My mum looked at me, wide-eyed. In a shocked tone, she yells at me, "Patricia, come here. What is that in the back of your leg?" Confused, I replied, "What do you mean, Mum?" She points to my thigh. "Look." On my right thigh are 3 large scratch marks, almost blood red. Last night during the chase, it must have scratched me. I guess I didn't notice at the time due to the adrenaline rushing through me. Well, needless to say, we never walked out there after dark again. Around 2 or 3 years ago, I lived with my grandparents in the backwoods area, mostly known for their bears. I saw these bears several times, but never was in serious danger, as they would get scared and run off. But there was an encounter that I thought was very strange. In the living room, we have a glass sliding door that when you open it, immediately enters our backyard that is right in front of the woods. It was a Friday night, around 11-12 AM I would guess, and I was laying down on my couch in the living room and watching TV. All was going well until I got a wave of paranoia that washed over me. I felt like someone or something was watching me. I had been diagnosed with paranoia, so I just ignored and told myself it was my brain messing with me. Around 10, maybe 15 minutes later, there's the sound of 5 to 15 knocks on the glass door. I was obviously terrified and went to wake up my mum. She told me that if it happens again, wake her up. So I closed the curtains on the door all the way and laid back down. Around 5 minutes later, there was yet another series of knocks, this time much longer. I did as my mum told me and woke her up. She woke up my dad and he grabbed his gun and flashlight and went outside to see if there was anything out there. When he came back inside, he said it was probably just a bear or another wild animal. I took his word for it, and this time I went and laid down in my parents' room. I know this could have been an animal, but I've always had a bad feeling about the woods and the house itself. Another experience I had was when me and my cousin who lived down the street were inside a house that was under construction due to the hurricane that had damaged our town a few months before. When we entered it was around 8 or 9, maybe 10, so it was dark. We had brought our flashlights and we were walking into rooms when my flashlight died. This was before the other experience, so I didn't think much of it or get scared, so I proceeded to head out of the room to find my cousins. When I was leaving the room, I noticed a pair of white glowing orbs. I ran out of the room scared and met back up with my cousins. I told them about what happened and they said it was most likely wild animal, so I shrugged it off and went home. For reference, I am a female, and this is something that happened to me about 26 years ago when I was 22 and living with my mum and stepdad in a small community known as Juniper Wood Ranch, which sat just outside of a small town in Arizona. Juniper Wood Ranch got its name from the juniper trees that enveloped the landscape of the community. The roads at the time were unpaved and rough in certain spots, and when it rained, it was extremely difficult to get in or out because the creeks would flood in the red clay. Anyway, one day my friend Marlon, who lived about 2 miles further up from where we lived, came over and asked me if I wanted to spend the weekend with her at her place, and if I wanted to go to Jerome with her the next day. I said yeah, that sounds like fun. So I packed up some things and we got into her truck and drove off towards her house. Now, the further you get back into Juniper Woods, the more isolated and scarce the population becomes, and now you're surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. We got to her house and I settled in, and we began to talk about different things that girls talk about. Later that evening, as she was cooking dinner, I decided I would go and explore around her property, just enjoy the quiet and the beauty of my surroundings. The whole time I was outside, the air felt heavy and I always felt like something was watching me. I just felt completely uneasy. Well anyway, later we ate dinner and she asked me if I wanted to watch a movie, and I said sure thing. So, she asked me if I'd ever seen the movie The Howling, and I told her yeah, I think maybe once. She said great, that's the movie we're watching, and I go cool. She puts the movie in and she goes into the kitchen to make us some popcorn and something to drink, and when she returned she started the movie. We started watching it, and now I remembered why I only watched it once. There's just something about The Howling that unnerves me and literally scares me to death. I don't know. Maybe it's the way it invokes almost raw and pure fear inside of me is why I don't watch it. Even to this day, I still have nightmares. Well, after the movie was over, she said, "We need to go to sleep, we've got a long and busy day tomorrow." And I said okay. And we said good night and she went off to her room. Her house had 4 large windows in her living room that did not have curtains on them. As I laid on the couch, the light from the moon that hung high that night illuminated almost the entire room. Feeling myself dozing off, I rolled over, got comfortable and covered my head. I don't know how long I laid there before I heard this low guttural growl and heavy breathing. Thinking to myself, okay, you just watched a horror movie and your mind is playing tricks on you, and I need to stop scaring myself. As I was trying to get comfortable, I heard the noise again. For whatever reason, I took my head out from under the covers and wished to God I hadn't. Standing not but a few feet away, there was something very large, hairy, and staring at me with human-like eyes in intense anger. I quickly threw the covers back over my head and laid there frozen and shaking, thinking at any time this creature was going to attack me and possibly kill me. Again, I don't know how long I laid there, when it seemed like it had moved closer to me because its breathing and growling sounded closer, and I could feel its hot breath on me. The smell was overwhelming, nauseating in fact, and I fought back the urge to throw up.
I took my head out from under the covers again, and it had moved closer, and I could just now make out what the creature looked like. The creature had to have stood over 7 feet tall, had a head and snout like a wolf and a hair like a wire brush. Its arms were semi-long and it had razor-sharp claws. Its legs looked deformed. They didn't look like they should be able to hold that kind of weight or height. And its teeth. Oh God, its teeth. They were long and yellow. Its mouth was dripping with drool. I tried to let out a scream, but nothing would come out. Frozen and unable to move, I just laid there, staring at whatever the hell this thing was as it stared back at me. I don't know if it was from pure fear, but I must have passed out because the next thing I know, my friend Marilyn is waking me up and telling me that breakfast is done. She stops and looks at me and goes, "Are you alright, hun? You don't look so good." I couldn't say anything, but what she asked me next terrified me just as much as the creature did. She asked me how I had slept and did I see anything scary last night. I don't know what it was or if it was just my imagination. Was my friend Marilyn a skinwalker? I don't know, because I never went back to stay the night at her house again. I used to stay at my grandparents' house a lot when I was younger. They wanted to help out and such. They owned a 40-50 acre farm with their house about a quarter mile into the woods. It was summer and we were all going to bed. I always have had trouble falling asleep and was the only one awake and was returning from the bathroom to join my cousin on the top bunk with me in the bottom. The bedroom had one window facing a light post my grandparents had installed. I was just covering myself up when I saw something cast a shadow against the window curtain. Once, then twice. It was fast, but I could tell there was something moving outside. I crawl out of bed, hugging the floor, already scared. I was about a foot from the closed curtain with my eye just above the windowsill. I stared out and nothing happened for a few seconds. Then I saw a figure cast a shadow onto the curtain. It looked like a big dog head. A long snout, tall pointed ears. It stopped perfectly centre of the window frame, then slowly turned its head to face me. I froze, but it then raised up a few inches to show its shoulders. I can only describe it as a wolf head on a human body. Then it turned away and moved on. People said I was young, it was only a nightmare. It wasn't, I remember it too vividly. I forgot to mention that this window was about 5 feet up from the ground. It was my mother's old room as a child, and when I asked her if she'd ever saw anything, she paused for several seconds, began to speak, shook her head, and stuttered out a no. She knew the folklore and refused to speak, and we dropped it. But I knew why she responded that way. Never mention them aloud. I can't explain this, I'm still scared to be alone at night there. Even typing this gave me goosebumps. For reference, I am a female and this happened to me in the summer of 1984 when I was 13 years old. So anyways, that summer my parents sent me and my twin sister to camp for the summer. For obvious reasons, I'll be changing the name of the camp to Camp Up High. Camp Up High is located on Angeles National Forest near Mount Wilson, which is 52 miles from Long Beach, California. Anyways, we get to the camp and are introduced to our camp counsellors and given a tour of the camp. I immediately fell in love with it because it was beautiful, but my twin sister didn't seem too happy. Well anyways, later that night after dinner, the counsellors gathered all of us together around a campfire to tell stories, roast marshmallows and make s'mores. So about a week after getting to camp and during dinner, one of the counsellors named Running Rooster told us that the next day we would be getting up early and going on a hike to another campground where we would spend the night. Getting up next morning and after breakfast, we all went to our cabins and gathered up our camping stuff and met up with counsellors at the snack barn. After the counsellors made sure that we were all there, we started off on our hike. I remember being excited because I had always loved outdoors. Now, mind you, this was during the 80s, long before cell phones and social media, so hearing stories about cryptids and skinwalkers and dogmen were unheard of.
I remember how beautiful everything was, and the smell of fresh pine trees and the sounds of nature echoed around me. I also remember while walking on the trail, a group of trees to my left, and hearing a sound that kind of startled me at first. But when I looked, I realised it was a group of soldiers on the ground for a training mission. While standing there watching them, it dawned on me that I was way behind my group. So, in a hurry to get caught up with them, I didn't notice how quiet everything became around me. After crossing a small stream to catch my breath and realising it was too quiet, I kinda started getting scared because I still didn't hear or see my group. That's when I first heard something moving diagonally to the right of me. That's also when I smelled whatever it was. Darting my head to the right, that's when I saw it. It was standing half behind one of the pine trees. In shock and unable to move or scream, I just stood there staring at whatever this creature was. I know it had to stand at least 7 to 8 feet tall. All of its body was covered in semi-long brownish hair except for its face. It almost looked human, but its arms were longer than they should have been and its hands were huge. This thing was large and its legs didn't look like it could hold its weight. I remember how god-awful it smelled. I almost puked. After standing there for what seemed like forever, I heard my name being called off in the distance, breaking me out of my trance. I took off running towards the group. That's when I realised whatever that was chasing me. Hearing my name again, I ran even faster because I just wanted to get the hell away from it and be safe. After getting back with my group, I realised that it had stopped chasing me, so I started calming down. And that's when one of my sisters asked me what was wrong, and I told her nothing. I don't know what I saw that day, and still don't, but I can tell you it was not natural nor human, and it's something I've never forgotten and is forever burned in my memory. In my quiet suburban neighbourhood, there was a house with a peculiar resident named Mr. Anderson. He was rarely seen outside, always keeping to himself. His eyes darted nervously, avoiding any direct contact with others. Rumours circulated among the neighbourhood children that he had a sinister secret. One day, curiosity got the best of me, and I decided to pay Mr. Anderson a visit. As I approached his front door, a sense of unease washed over me. I knocked politely, but there was no answer. Undeterred, I peered through a window, hoping to catch a glimpse of his world. To my surprise, I saw a dimly lit room cluttered with stacks of newspapers, old photographs, and peculiar objects. The sight was unsettling, but my curiosity pushed me to continue investigating. Days turned into weeks, and I started noticing strange occurrences late at night. I could hear faint sounds coming from Mr. Anderson's house, like whispered conversations and shuffling footsteps. It seemed he was not alone. Unable to shake my growing concern, I contacted local authorities, sharing my suspicions. They agreed to investigate, and together we entered Mr. Anderson's home. With each step, my heart pounded, not knowing what we would find. As we ventured further, we discovered a hidden room, its walls covered in newspaper clippings and photographs of missing persons. It was chilling. It became clear that Mr. Anderson had been stalking his neighbours, meticulously documenting their lives and routines. The true extent of Mr. Anderson's obsession and potential harm he could have caused, I shall never forget. The rumours were not mere gossip. The creepy neighbour had been quietly observing, cataloguing and potentially planning something more sinister. Relief washing over me, knowing that we had exposed Mr. Anderson's unsettling activities. From that day forward, we remained vigilant, keeping a watchful eye on our surroundings, determined to ensure the safety and well-being of our community. I had always heard strange whispers and muffled footsteps in my house, unsettling sounds that echoed through the halls, but it wasn't until that fateful day when I stumbled upon the truth about my enigmatic neighbour, Mrs. Jenkins. Driven by an unshakable curiosity, I embarked on a thorough investigation of the eerie noises that plagued my home. It was during my search that I discovered a hidden passage concealed behind a dusty bookshelf. My body went rigid as I cautiously ventured into the dark, secret realm hidden within the walls of my own home. In the dimly lit room, I found Mrs. Jenkins,
her once sweet countenance replaced by a wild-eyed gaze. She appeared dishevelled, her unkempt hair framing her pale face as if she had emerged from a forgotten nightmare. My voice trembled as I demanded answers, desperate to understand how she had managed to infiltrate the sanctuary of my residence. Mrs. Jenkins, in a chillingly calm voice, confessed to living with the secret room for years, concealed from the prying eyes of the world. She had mastered the art of blending in, becoming an unnoticed presence, silently observing my every move and eavesdropping on my most intimate conversations. A rush of fear surged through me as I comprehended the magnitude of her intrusion. That horrible feeling I got when I first encountered her suddenly made sense. She had been a silent voyeur, extracting every detail of my life from within the very walls that held me. My once comforting home transformed into a chilling labyrinth of paranoia. Every week of the floorboards became a potential sign of Mrs. Jenkins' presence, every flicker of a shadow a reminder of her unwelcomed intrusion. Sleep became an elusive luxury as her haunting presence invaded my nightmares. In an act of desperation, I confronted Mrs. Jenkins, demanding an explanation for her disturbing behaviour. Her hollow eyes locked onto mine, revealing a depth of loneliness and obsession. She spoke in her deluded belief that she had found solace within the confines of my home, hidden away in her secret realm. Overwhelmed and violated, I had no choice but to involve the authorities. The investigation uncovered a troubling past for Mrs. Jenkins, a history marked by obsession and mental instability. She was swiftly removed from my home, but the scars of her intrusion remained etched deeply within my psyche. From that day on, I became hyper-vigilant, installing an array of security systems and fortifying the walls. The sense of safety I once enjoyed with my home was shattered, replaced by an unsettling paranoia. Each noise became a potential threat, each shadow harbouring of Mrs. Jenkins' unwelcome return. The chilling encounter taught me a lesson that would forever shape my perception of safety and trust. Sometimes the most sinister terrors can be found not in haunted houses or the darkest corners of our imagination, but within the very walls we call our own. I live in a quaint suburban neighbourhood where everyone knows everyone. It's a place where people feel safe, but there's something about my next door neighbour, Mr. Harris, that sends shivers down my spine. From the moment I moved in, there was an air of mystery surrounding him. He rarely leaves his house, and when he does, it's always under the cover of darkness. The few times we've interacted, I couldn't help but notice his unsettling gaze and the unnerving way he smiled, as if hiding something sinister. Late at night I often hear strange noises coming from his house. Whispers that seem to drift through the walls, accompanied by a faint, eerie music that seeps into my dreams. It's as if the house itself holds secrets that it's desperate to reveal. One day, while taking a stroll through the neighbourhood, I noticed an unusual sight. Behind Mr. Harris's house, hidden among overgrown bushes, was a small graveyard. It sent chills through my veins, realising that he was living in the midst of the deceased. As the days went by, I started noticing peculiar occurrences. Items would go missing from my yard, only to reappear in strange places overnight. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of Mr. Harris lurking in the shadows, watching my every move with an unsettling intensity. The final straw came when I discovered a newspaper article, buried deep in online archives. I revealed a dark truth about Mr. Harris, his involvement in a series of unsolved disappearances that had plagued our town years ago. The missing individuals were never found, and their case remained open, casting a cloud of fear over the community. Terrified, I naturally decided to share my findings with the local authorities. But as I gathered the evidence, a sense of paranoia overcame. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that Mr. Harris knew what I had uncovered. In the dead of night, I hear a tapping on my window, a haunting melody accompanying it. When I summoned the courage to look outside, I saw Mr. Harris standing there, a twisted grin on his face. It was a chilling sight that confirmed my worst fears. He knew, and he was coming for me. With a pounding heart, I quickly packed my belongings and fled from the neighbourhood, leaving behind the unsettling presence of Mr. Harris. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that he still lurks in the shadows, waiting for the next unsuspecting neighbour to fall prey to his sinister intentions. Believe me when I say, you never know who your neighbour is, or what they're doing.
I was never considered to be popular in high school. At best I had maybe 5 or 6 good close friends who I'd hang out with most weekends. I normally wouldn't attend parties thrown by the cool kids, even if I was invited. I preferred to stick with my good friends, doing things like riding dirt bikes, shooting and having bonfires. My best friend, let's call him Zach, and I lived out in the rural parts of our region. This area had a lot of wetlands, marsh and canals which were part of the swampland surrounding the area. Luckily there were no alligators, but the place was abundant with poisonous snakes and even black bears. Zach and I, along with our friend Ian, we would often go camping in these areas. Truth is that seeing a black bear was pretty rare, and as long as you avoided the snakes, they'll leave you alone. There were quite a few campsites only accessible by boat. Zach's family owned a local campground where his grandfather had an old Boston whaler skiff, maybe 12 feet long. This was plenty enough to fit our camping equipment, which included the usual stuff like a tent, sleeping bags, lanterns and a small propane grill. Of course, we also had a couple coolers of beer, water and food. This particular camping trip, it was myself, Zach, Ian and our other friend Austin, who went to another school but knew Zach from back in the day. The 4 of us had planned our trip for Labour Day weekend so we could have an extra day to spend camping. We had planned it for months, saving up enough money for beer and other supplies. A couple of weeks before we left, there was an announcement that a hurricane was set to hit our area at the same weekend. Due to the geography of our area, most hurricanes slow down and turn into a tropical storm or depression. It's not nearly as much of a threat as an actual hurricane. We went ahead with our plans anyway, since it was our senior year and we knew we'd all be in college the following year, not knowing how many more trips we'd get. That Saturday, we loaded the boat up with our supplies and launched off. The hurricane had since become a tropical depression, and it looked like it would change trajectories anyway. It was about a 45-minute trip to the secluded campground we'd go to. The place basically never had anyone else there, so we were free to do what we normally did. Drink some beers, shoot our .22 rifles at the empty cans of water moccasins swimming around the canal, and sit around the fire telling stories. Looking back, I'm amazed Zach's dad let us go. Teenage boys carrying coolers full of beer with a few .22 rifles. I'm sure you're thinking we're all dumb for doing that, but we were actually responsible, looking out for one another and always made sure the guns were away once we started drinking. The worst part about it was the cell reception was spotty at best, so you'd be lucky to get a few text messages delivered. This was also before smartphones, so we had no way of checking the weather report unless we wanted to cost our parents a boatload of money, and that was even if we could get any bars. Anyway, as the day progressed, dark storm clouds started to roll in. This wasn't unexpected because the storm wasn't too far off course, so some rain was in the forecast. Zach's dad was an avid outdoorsman and had a tent that could survive winds higher than what was predicted. It was basically a mini house, sleeping 10 people comfortably with 4 separated sections. We anchored it down in the hardest dirt we could find and made sure the rain tarp was secured tight. We finished our evening by making some burgers and polishing off a 24-pack of Bud Light until the rain came in. We quickly hustled off to the tent to play card games and drink more beer. I remember thinking, man, that rain is coming down, and it hasn't stopped, just before going to sleep. Sometime later that night, I was awoken by Ian shaking me, sounding freaked out. Look outside, he kept saying. I unzipped the tent and looked, only to see our boat floating closer to our tent, while the dock we tied it to was completely gone. Even the posts standing about 4 feet above the dock were completely submerged. The water had risen at least 5 feet and had crept within a few feet of our tent. The strip of land where we had set up camp was only about 50-60 feet wide, surrounded by water on 3 sides like a peninsula. It was then that we were faced with a decision. 1, we could try to wait out the storm, moving our tent back to higher ground, which was only maybe another 10 feet or so. Or 2, we could quickly pack, hopefully reaching the boat in time before it was surrounded by water, and drive 45 minutes in the dark with only a couple of strong flashlights to guide us. Everyone besides Zach thought we should go. Seeing that we didn't have service and if the water kept rising, which it surely would, we'd be in serious danger. We eventually convinced Zach to agree to cut the trip short and sloppily packed our things. We ended up having to jump from the ground to the boat, cutting the rope, tying it to the dock, which was about 4 or 5 feet below the water at this point. I sat up front, shining the strongest flashlight about 20 feet in front of us. It was quite possibly the worst trip of my life. We had dumped our coolers in order to make the boat go faster, but it couldn't go full speed due to the wake from the rising flood. Heavy, cold rain stung our faces and eyes, temporarily blinding us. Either side of the canal was completely submerged. The narrow channel had risen at least 10 feet. As we rounded a corner, I felt a scratch from underneath the boat to my right. The small skiff lurched, then suddenly tipped, throwing the 4 of us into the dark, murky water. It was then when my mind began thinking about my parents and siblings. How sad and angry they would be that I died so young. I thought about how I'd never get to go to college and have a good job. I thought about my dreams of running off to the west coast for grad school after I finished. I felt the weight of my steel-toed boots dragging me down into the muddy abyss. It was at this point when I saw the boat a few yards away flipped over, illuminated by the spotlight I had been using. I swam to it and found that my 3 companions had found a dry spot off the bank. They had been screaming for me, but due to the heavy wind and rain, I couldn't hear them. We dragged the boat back to the bank, flipping it, and miraculously got the engine started. We must have drove 5 miles an hour the whole way home. I can tell you it was the longest boat ride of my life. We were cold, soaked to the bone, and making matters worse, still pretty impaired from all the beer we had consumed. When we saw the light off the boat ramp, we all thanked God. It was a short walk to Zach's house from there. Turns out his dad had been frantically trying to call us to tell us to come home. As it happens, the storm had hit a warm patch off the coast, strengthened and changed trajectories, hitting us directly. Winds that night were reported up to 80 miles an hour, and massive flooding in some low areas even caused people to evacuate. The worst part was telling Zach's dad about the damage his boat had taken and losing his tent and one of his 22 rifles. He was upset, but I think he felt responsible for letting us go in the first place. We finished the weekend by having a hurricane party at Zach's place, staying there Saturday and Sunday night playing video games and eating junk food. Unfortunately, it was our last camping trip, and sadly we don't see each other much anymore since I followed my dream to move to the west coast. Zach stays home and worked for his family, while Ian joined the Navy and started his own family. We do still keep in touch and plan to have another camping trip in the future, this time making sure the weather's clear. About halfway between Providence and New London, you could find my homely cottage nestled beneath the shade of old naughty red pines. A man I know well mentioned to me the surrounding area was previously farmland. Before that, it was believed to be a hunting camp. He said they found caches of ancient flakes and tools leading all the way up to the bog behind my back fence. That is where I saw the eyes, just beyond those weathered pickets, tucked within the mess of gnarled briars. I lied awake staring at the swirls in the ceiling, illuminated by my bedside candle, following the pattern across the room until the mundane thoughts of the day dissipated, allowing me to slip into a comfortable slumber. I could hear the slight wobble of the ceiling fan as it spun overhead, and the cycling of the refrigerator compressor a few rooms away, but there was something outside my window which caused my head to jerk and skin to prickle. There was rustling in the leaves, not from a small creature by any means. Its strides sounded familiar, almost bipedal, and were advancing quickly. It became louder and more chilling as it approached the divide between the wilderness and my declared plot. I grabbed a flashlight from the side of my tent and exhaled a trebling breath which half-heartedly extinguished the candle's flame. I crept up to the window and bent my ear closely in efforts to sate my curiosity. Again, it stirred the forest floor, and I rested my elbow on the windowsill and aimed my unlit flashlight with diligence, right where I heard the sound, with the button loaded ready to release at movement. It does, so I cast the beam through the prickly vines and pickets, and to much surprise it reflects back at me through the gaze of 2 round spheres with a prominent glossed milky haze. Its body remained hidden behind the vegetation so no other features could be discerned. Although my hand trembled, I did not waver the light, neither did the eyes. They didn't blink or drift. This lasted for what felt like an hour. Two statues locked in eternal stare, fully succumbed to fear and curiosity alike. The battery in my flashlight gave up, and immediately the rustling began again. Frantically, I crawled across the nylon of the pitch-black room to find batteries in the bed table drawer, but by the time I made the swap it was too late. I panned the tree line with the cone of light, desperate for a hint of something. Anything that would provide answer for the inexplicable and hellish gaze. The eyes haven't appeared again in the woods, but they did elsewhere. They plague my thoughts almost every moment. The empty, lifeless stare populates my consciousness like a plague of rats, biting and tearing away at the pieces which remain loosely tethered. Now I lie awake for a different reason. For every time I begin to drift away, I see those dead, hungry eyes. Its mouth seemed to stretch across the entirety of its face, like an exaggerated grin. My flashlight shook rapidly in my hand and I was shivering once again, but this time not from the cold. After a moment passed, I heard a noise that made my heart sink to my stomach. Daniel called out to me, asking if I could see anything. When his tiny voice carried out from the tent, this thing before me twitched and turned its attention to my son's voice, who was still inside the tent. It seemed like it was drawn to the sound of my son's voice. Its face angled down towards the nylon material, its smiling mouth began to widen. Then its lower jaw dropped nearly a foot long. A row of thin, razor-sharp teeth lined the top and the bottom of its mouth. It raised its unnaturally long arm high up into the air, and I realised then what it was going to do. My body reacted on its own as I reached my hand inside the tent, grabbing onto Daniel, and I pulled as hard as I could. Daniel and I came crashing to the ground as this thing assaulted and tore through our tent. During the onslaught, I helped Daniel by placing my hand over his mouth, as his tears began to coat my hand. We stared silently at this thing eviscerating our tent. During this, one of our bags had been sent flying towards us, crashing right next to me. Realising it was my bag, I reached over and felt through the pockets before finding my car keys. I whispered into Daniel's ear that when I gave the signal to run for the car as fast as he could, despite his distress, he nodded. A few moments after the creature started attacking our tent, a noise drew its attention off into the woods. I turned towards the sound, and that's when I told Daniel to run. We both rose to our feet and dashed towards our car. A deafening shriek filled the air behind us as we ran. Right before we made it, I rapidly clicked the unlock button, and we both entered the car, slamming and locking the doors behind us. I started the car, and when the lights came on, that thing was standing directly before us, an angry grin plastered across its elongated face. I threw the car into reverse and we backed out of there. I spun the car around in the soft dirt and we drove the trail back onto the main road, trying desperately not to crash in the process. We didn't stop driving until we made it home. The entire drive, Daniel didn't say a word. He just sobbed quietly in his seat while I struggled not to do the same. Since that day, I've decided to never take my son camping again.
It was supposed to be a camping trip to make memories, a couple of mates, a campfire, talking shit into the night. Jake was leaving for a new job, heading to a town none of us had ever been to. We were excited, sure, maybe a bit jealous, but we were proud of what he'd accomplished in a phone interview, to get out of this shitty small town. We packed up light, snack, food and beer. In hindsight, not a great idea, but we were young and dumb, more interested in a good time than staying warm or decent meals. By the time we arrived to our suite, it was bordering on dusk. We hurriedly set up a fire, pitching the measly tents we had brought, cracking a couple of cold cans. When we finally settled down, gathered our camp chairs around the roaring fire, stars pinpricked in the sky, looking like confetti above about to rain down on us at any time. We all drank too much, and in the early hours of the morning, we stumbled into our respective tents. I woke to the sun streaming in through the unzipped tent, I blinked at it a few times, adjusting to the brightness. Outside it was eerily quiet. Our fire was still smouldering. Empty beer cans littered the ground. The car sat where it had been parked, wet with morning dew. I called out a few times, and then I began checking the tents, which were all empty. There was nothing out of place, no signs of a struggle. It looked like they had just woken up during the night and wandered off. I checked my phone, there was no reception. I didn't know what else to do, so I did what I could. I waited. By mid-morning it was hot, and I heard a peep from no one. Even the forest seemed silent. I had wondered how populated the area would be, looking at it on the map when I picked it out. It seemed secluded. It seemed safe. And for me, for what I needed to get done, it had been absolutely perfect. I took one last look around the campsite, carefully putting out the smouldering fire, making sure the tents hadn't turned to ash, as I made my way to the car. In my pocket, Jake's license, his apartment key. Everyone had always said how much we looked alike. Even though our lives were the total opposite, we could have been brothers. Maybe if I had been born to the right family. I focused on remembering the good times with my mates, ignoring the most recent memories of slipping a lethal amount of sleeping pills in their beers, while I remained sober. I tried to forget the hole, how long it had taken to dig in the forest floor, while containing my excitement of leaving this shitty town and starting a new job in a town I've never been to. I'm 19 and my sister was 20, and we went on a camping trip recently. I was really excited, but it went downhill fast. For context, my sister, let's call her V, recently broke up with her now ex-boyfriend. She was extremely depressed, so I suggested going on a camping trip. She always loved those when we were younger. She agreed, but now I wonder if she went because I wanted to. I feel extremely awful. V was seemingly normal when we arrived, maybe a little less talkative, but I understood why. She barely said a word until a few hours later. She said she was tired and wanted to sleep. I laughed at her and responded, "Really? I'm usually the one who sleeps first. It's literally 4 p.m. I immediately regretted saying that. Her whole facial expressions changed, and a sense of unnerving dread was burning me alive. Her calm, slight smile changed to a dead, lifeless stare. "Well, you can sleep if you want. I'll just be bored alone," I sighed. This was unlike her. The sense of dread had gone away as her little smile came back. She thanked me and immediately laid down. I left the cabin to take a walk around. I barely had any service, but I still managed to text my friend, William, and tell him about how weird V was acting. His response, which I had expected, was that she was probably tired from being stressed out. I felt the same sense of dread fill my lungs as I struggled to breathe. I heard a noise, like a croaking frog, and turned around. V was on all fours and staring up at me. What the fuck? I fell down in shock. When I showed any reaction towards her, V immediately ran away. Like a deceased animal, I can only describe as she was limping away. When I finally regained myself, I ran back to the cabin, only to be met with V sleeping, as if she had never left the cabin in the first place. V, what the fuck was that? When she awoke, she asked me what I was talking about. "Let me look at your hands." She refused. "Let me look." She slapped me. I could feel the dirt and grass on my face. She started pleading with me and saying it was a mistake, but anger overwhelmed me. Before I even knew what I was doing, I had locked her inside the cabin and I was driving down the road. It's been about 2 weeks since then, and the guilt has overwhelmed me. So I'm asking you guys, am I the asshole? Should I go back and free her? I used to camp in the backyard with my little sister whenever our parents fought. They didn't fight much, but when they did, it was World War III and we were the refugees. I'd set up the tent while Mum and Dad shouted in the kitchen. I'd start a fire in our fire pit and the argument inside would bolster. All the while, Maggie sat on the fence and watched me set up camp. As dark as those days were, I always had fun camping with Maggie. We always played Monopoly. I let her be the car and she showed me mercy every time I landed on the boardwalk. Whenever we camped, we'd pick back up where we left off. No one ever won. Sometimes we sat by the fire and made up scary stories, but we always gave them cheerful endings. The monster in the closet was just a jacket. The girl wasn't missing, she just went to the park. The trail of blood was just a horrific ketchup accident. One summer night, I was setting up camp again. Maggie sat on the fence eating a popsicle and Mum screamed and Dad inside. The fire was taking some time to get started. When I finally got it going, I said, "Let there be light." Then I looked up expecting to see a smile on Maggie's face, but I didn't see her at all. She didn't fall behind the fence. She didn't go inside with Mum and Dad. She wasn't at a friend's house. She wasn't at the park. She wasn't anywhere. I'd gone to the park every day after that night. When school started back up, every day became once a week. When I went off to college, once a week became once a month. It's been 10 years since Maggie disappeared, and I still wonder if the screams I heard that day weren't Mum's.
My wife and I moved into our old house in New England in summer 2000. We had looked at dozens of houses, but this one just immediately felt like home. Soon after, we invited our good friend James and his husband up for a weekend. Keep James and his husband in mind. We were pretty well into getting our late night party on, playing cards, drinking, smoking in the dining room. Out the corner of my eye I saw, though the experience was more like perceived, very vividly, an older woman with jet black hair sitting next to the old upright piano in the corner. The piano came with the house. We specifically requested that the previous owner include it in the sale because it was so cool, and we didn't have much furniture. It wasn't even slightly scary. In fact, it was just like she was hanging out. I mentioned it to everyone and we laughed it off. Drinking and fun continued through the night. I was never really a ghost believer and still a skeptic 100%, but the rest of the story makes me really wonder. Several weeks later, we met a neighbour from down the street who lived in the neighbourhood for 45 years. "You live in the Muriel King house," she tells us. Muriel was a really interesting lady. She was a famous fashion designer in the 1930s, please Google her, that lived there alone after her husband committed suicide. Very tragic, but she was an interesting lady. Very independent and ahead of her time. She travelled all over the world. She was Greek, I think. Greek, I asked. Weird question, but did she have black hair? Yes, she had jet black hair even when she was an older woman. It was very striking. Yep, I got the chills right then. Many weeks later, I met another neighbour from down the street that had lived there for 60 plus years, and he starts telling me about Muriel. She was a famous fashion designer. She designed gowns for Rita Hayworth and all the classic film stars. And she designed costumes for Broadway plays too. Her parties were legendary, he tells me. She used to have all her gay boyfriends from Broadway come up on the train and they'd drink and sing show tunes at the piano in the dining room all night long. Yep, now this could all be coincidental, but now I'm having my doubts. But she must have been an awesome woman. People from around town have given us some of her original drawings and even unfinished dress she was working on. There haven't been any more Muriel sightings, but shortly after my wife got pregnant 20 years ago, we both woke up out of a cold sleep at the same time and looked at each other like, what the fuck? And then our bedroom door slammed hard. We like to think that Muriel wasn't a fan of kids. She had never had any of her own, so she was like, later, I'm out of here. In 2020, at the beginning of COVID, I had just given birth. At this time, I could only have one other person in the room with me my entire stay at the hospital. Of course, my kid's father was there. but like the third day he left to clean up our house and get everything prepared for me and the baby. I had gotten sick and had a C-section, so I had to stay for about 4 to 5 days. Well, while he was away, a nurse named Kelly said she would be helping me throughout the day and spending time with me so I didn't feel lonely while Dad is gone. I couldn't really hold my baby due to being sick and the pain from the C-section, so my nurses would come in every time it was time to feed. I noticed when they came in, they would acknowledge Kelly and she would go to the farthest part of the room and she would tell me, "I'm just going to get out of the way." Now, she did tell me that she didn't specialise in what they did, she was just for comfort, so I didn't question anything. The entire day she was so helpful and encouraging to me. I really believe I would have broken down if she wasn't in there with me. She was such a sweetheart. Well, after about 5 or 6 hours, she told me she had to leave and that she would come visit me before her shift was over to see how I was doing. She hugged me and blew a kiss at my baby and walked out of the room. Later that night, Dad came back and he was very upset. He had told me some stuff happened with his mum and that he was sorry he took so long. I was upset, but I told him a nurse named Kelly kept me company. And as I'm telling him about her, my nurse is changing my sheets and she's like, "Who's Kelly?" I explained and she said that nobody named Kelly was in the room or working that day. So I instantly thought about those women who would pretend to be nurses and kidnap children. But my nurse told me that I may be hallucinating and she told the doctor. I talked to my doctor and he said the same thing. Well, a couple of hours later, a nurse that I didn't recognise came in my room and said, "I know this might sound crazy, but everyone on the floor is talking about you seeing Kelly." I said, "Yeah, she was there with me for like 7 hours today. She helped out a lot." We were smiling and laughing while I was telling her about Kelly and how sweet and funny she was. Then she pulled up her phone and showed me pictures of her and Kelly that looked like to be maybe early 2000s. I was smiling knowing that I wasn't hallucinating. Then she sat down and told me Kelly died over 10 years ago from a domestic violence with her boyfriend. I wasn't too shocked because my entire life I've been dealing with paranormal. But I got chills because I never had an encounter this deep. Well, the lady gave me a hug and started crying, saying, "Now I know that she is okay." Since that day, I've been wondering why did Kelly come in my room and help me. I kinda wish I could see her again. I wouldn't consider myself a very spiritual person, but I have no explanation for what I encountered on my family's property and was hoping someone had an answer as to whether or not this was some kind of spirit or entity. My family has around 360 acres in North Oklahoma that has been in our family since the land rush. Growing up, the family would meet there for Thanksgiving and Christmas, but as the family expanded, it was quickly outgrown. Nowadays, I am about the only person that goes there, and I go and went there regularly to train with my firearms. I went there earlier this year and had an experience that shook me so badly that I haven't spoken about it until recently, and will never go back there alone. I arrived around 2 PM and set up my targets, but something fell up. I use an electronic headset for hearing protection that also amplifies ambient noise, and I noticed that everything seemed to stop. No wind, no bugs, no birds, nothing. Just complete and total silence, which is very unusual for the area. I run my normal drills, and as the sun starts to set, things get stranger. Odd smells, like a dirty litter box and body odour, started coming around, and I noticed that the coyotes were crossing the field west of me, almost as if they were intentionally avoiding entering the woods nearby. Then I started hearing interference coming over my headset, and what sounded like disembodied voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. Now I'm starting to worry. I start gathering my things and I hear what sounds like a woman's blood-curdling screams coming from the woods. Around the same time, I got what I can only describe as nauseating feeling of being watched. Shortly followed by very distinct footsteps trudging through the foliage in the tree line, approximately 30 yards from my position. I've been an avid hunter since childhood, familiar with noises of the woods, and the cadence of the footsteps indicated a large bipedal creature, oddly human-like. I pull my phone out to take a video and I start scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Standing behind a tree at the edge of the tree line was a tall black silhouette with spindly limbs and a pale face, looking directly at me. I managed to capture a great still image of it from the video that I will try to find and attach. I quickly grabbed my range bag and made a run towards my truck. I get about 50 yards from the truck, and the light post on our property that's hooked up to the county power has never turned off in the 20 years I've been there, suddenly cuts off. Now I'm blindly running in the direction I believe my truck is in while I hit the unlock button on my fob to find the lights. I get in my truck, speed off, and as I'm watching the rear view, the light post turns back on. I apologise for the long post, but I'm finally ready to get this out in the open for interpretation. I tend to think of myself as a rational person that doesn't necessarily believe in the woo kind of stuff. Although my mother described me as being sensitive and somewhat gravitated towards energies as a child. I was doing everything I could to rationalise or come up with a reasonable explanation for things I was experiencing, but I have no explanation. The kind of fear this experience put into me is and was unlike any kind of fear I've ever felt.